Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Section 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites. By Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 7. Capriole, Part 2. Then, as before, a light mist begins to fall, and turns presently to a heavy rainstorm that becomes heavier the longer it lasts. Then, too, the path gets steep and stony, and the horses, which have for some time been showing signs of fatigue, slip and stumble at every step. As for the black, being frightened by a flash of very vivid lightning, he becomes suddenly restive, and all but carries the rider at a single bound into the gulf below. Hereupon we dismount, and letting the horses go down by the road, make our way in rain, wind, thunder, and lightning down a narrow zigzag path, at the bottom of which, some 300 feet below, appear the roofs and the church spire of Capriole. The Pezzés had given us up hours ago, but seeing our wretched little party coming along the village street, drenched, draggled, and miserable, rushed down in a body to meet and welcome us on the threshold. Old Signora Pezzé, gentle and cordial; young Signora Pezzé, still with a rose in her hair; the two sons whom we already know, and all the helps and hangers-on of the establishment. The men and horses arrive close upon our heels, but the caretta, left behind long since upon the road, never appears till some 2 hours later, having turned quite over on the edge of a precipice and deposited all our bags and rugs at the bottom of a steep and muddy gully, from which they were with difficulty recovered. Meanwhile a good fire is quickly lighted, wet clothing is taken to the kitchen to be dried, a hot supper is put in preparation, and all the discomforts of the journey are forgotten. Now the Pezzés is a large, old, rambling stone house, and consists, in fact, of 3 houses thrown into one. The floors are some of stone and some of wood. The rooms are at all sorts of levels. The windows are very small, and full of flowers. An old metal sign, as old apparently as the days of the Falieri, swings at the corner outside, and a balcony of antique Italian wrought iron juts out over the doorway. The public room on the first floor is panelled with oak and contains a fine carved ceiling, while the landings, as usual, are engaged as places to dine in. A set of rooms, however, including the unwonted luxury of a comfortable private sitting room, were assigned to us on the second floor, and these we retained during all the time that we made Capriole our headquarters. In the sitting room we had a sofa, a round table, a chiffonnier, and even a bookcase containing Guicciardini's History of Italy and Teatro Francese in 30 volumes. Here also were Ball's guidebooks, and Gilbert's Dolomite Mountains, presented to Signora Pezzé by the authors. On the walls, amid a variety of little framed prints and photographs, we found portraits of F.F.T. and his sisters; in the visitors' book the handwriting of J.A.S., of the N.'s, of the W.'s, and of other friends who had passed by in foregoing years. The place, in short, was warm with pleasant memories. No wonder that it seemed like home from the first, and was home while it lasted. At Capriole the traveller finds himself again in Italy. Coming down on foot in the pelting storm, we had crossed the frontier, it seemed, a little way above the zigzag. The village is but just over the border, and yet the houses and the people are as thoroughly Italian as if buried alive in the heart of the Apennines. It lies in a deep hollow at the foot of 4 mountains, and at the junction of 4 valleys. The 4 mountains are the Monte Frisolet, the Monte Mignon, the Monte Pezza, and the Monte Fernazza, known locally as the Monte Tos. The 4 valleys are the Val di Livinallungo, the Val Fiorentino, the Val Pettorina, and the Val d'Alleghe, or Caudeval. Each of the first 3 of these valleys, to say nothing of a 4th and apparently nameless tributary coming down a rocky glen behind the village, brings its torrent to swell the flood of the Cordevole, which, a couple of miles lower down, flows southward through the lake of the Alleghe on its way to join the Piave in the Val di Mel. The village, murky and unprepossessing at first sight, consists of one straggling street partly built upon arches. The church, which is in no wise remarkable unless for the decorations of the organ loft, on which is profanely painted a medallion head of the Apollo Belvedere surrounded by bouquets of flutes, fiddles, and tambourines, is situated on a rising ground near the foot of the zigzag. At the farther end of the village, on the side of Alleghe, stands the column of St. Mark, commemorative of the time when Caprile, like Cadore, owned the sovereignty of the Doge and the Council of Ten. The Venetian lion on the top, a battered medieval bronze, was robbed some years ago of his wings, and the commune has talked of replacing them ever since. A carved shield on the front of the column is charged with the arms of Caprile, and beneath it a square stone tablet bears the following inscription: Scipione, Benzono, Pats, Fens, Seri, Senati, Veni, Comus, Super, Finibus, Beneficentis, Caprilensis, Ere, PVB, POS, Anno 1559. The little piazza in which this roadside monument stands is called the Contrada di San Marco. The torrent runs close behind it on one side; the international Dogana overlooks it on the other. In this open space the young men of the village play at pallo all day long. To an onlooker this game, which in summer forms the absorbing occupation of half the middle class youth of Italy, would seem to be governed by no laws whatever, but to consist simply in tossing the ball from player to player. They use no bats, they mark off no boundaries, they make no running. Their interest in it, however, and their excitement are unbounded. They begin immediately after breakfast and go on till dusk, and when they are not playing they are smoking cigarettes and looking on. The Italians and Austrians profess nowadays to be the best friends in the world, especially at these little frontier posts where they are brought into perpetual contact. But I observed that the young men of Caprile, although their favourite playing ground lay just under the windows of the Dogana, never invited the Austrian soldiers to take part in the game. These latter, standing about with their hands in their pockets, or sitting on the steps of the column, watched the players in a melancholy way, and looked as if they found life dull at Caprile. The first sight that one goes out of doors to see is, of course, the Civita. The first walk or drive one takes is to the lake of Alleghe. As they both lie in the same direction, and as the best view of the mountain is gained from the road leading to the lake, if not from the actual borders of the lake, most of the few travellers who come this way content themselves with dispatching both in a single morning, and then believe that they have done Caprile. The grand façade of the Civita, a sheer, magnificent wall of upright precipice, seamed from crown to foot with thousands of vertical fissures, and rising in a mighty arch towards the centre, faces the north-west, looking directly up the Cordevole towards Caprile, and filling in the end of the valley as a great organ front fills in the end of a cathedral aisle. Towards evening it takes all the glow of the sunset. In the morning, while the sun is yet low in the east, it shows through a veil of soft blue shade, vague and unreal as a dream. It was thus I first saw it. I had gone rambling out through the village before breakfast, and suddenly the Civita rose up before me like a beautiful ghost, draped in haze against a background of light. I thought it then, for simple breadth and height, for symmetry of outline, for unity of effect, the most ideal and majestic-looking mountain I had ever seen, and I think so still. The lake of Alleghe lies about 2 miles south-southeast of Caprile, in a green amphitheatre at the foot of the Civita, the Monte Pezza, and the Monteo Fernazza. The way to it lies along the left bank of the Cordevole, which here flows in a broad, strong current, and is bordered on the side of the char road by a barren, pebbly tract, sparsely overgrown with weeds and bushes. The river is dark and deep and brown. The lake, which is but an expansion of the river, is of a wonderful greenish blue, sapphire streaked with emerald. The river is always rushing on at a headlong, irresistible pace. The lake, except where the wind sweeps straight up the valley, is as placid as a sheet of looking glass. The river, an aggregate of many tributaries, is as old, probably, as the mountains whence its many sources flow. The lake is new, a thing of yesterday. For 100 years are as yesterday in the world's history, and where the lake of Alleghe now mirrors the clouds and mountains, there were orchards and cornfields, farms and villages, only 102 years ago. A great bergfall from the Monte Pezza, or rather, 2 successive bergfalls, caused all this ruin and created all this beauty. These terrible catastrophes, as all travellers know, are common to mountain countries, but among these Dolomite valleys the bergfalls seem to have occurred, and seem to still occur, with greater frequency and on a more tremendous scale than elsewhere. You cannot walk or drive for 10 miles in any direction without coming upon some such scene of ruin. It may have happened last year, or 10 or 50 or 100 years ago, or it may have happened in prehistoric ages. Your guide in general knows nothing about it. You ask him when it happened. He shrugs his shoulders and says, "Chi lo sa?" But there at all events lie the piled rocks with their buried secrets, and often there is no outward difference to show which fell within the memory of man, and which before the date of man's creation. The history of the Lake of Alleghe has, however, been handed down with unusual accuracy. The date of the calamity and the extent of the damage done are registered in certain parish books and municipal records, and these again are supplemented by deeds and papers preserved by private families in the villages round about. Most of these families, and among them the Pezzis of Caprile, can tell of ancestors whose houses and lands were buried in the great fall of 1771. This is how it happened. The Monte Pezza, of which I shall have more to say hereafter, lies to the west of the lake, being the largest of the 4 mountains already mentioned as surrounding the hollow in which Caprile is built. Northwards it breaks away in abrupt precipices, culminating in a fine rocky summit some 8,000 feet above the level of the sea. But on the side nearest the lake it slopes down in a succession of rich woods, pastures, and picturesque ravines. Skirting the opposite shore one sees a vast, treacherous, smooth-looking slope of slaty rock, like a huge bald patch, extending all along the crest of the ridge on this side. It was from thence the fall came. It was this crest that slid away, slowly at first, and then with terrible swiftness down into the valley. The first disaster happened in the month of January 1771. A charcoal burner, it is said, who had been at work up in the woods, came down towards close of day, white and breathless, calling on those in the plain to save themselves, for the mountain was moving. A swift runner with the fear of death behind him, he fled from village to village, raising the cry as he went. But no one believed him. There were 4 villages then where now there is the lake. Incredulous of danger, the people of those 4 villages went to bed that evening as usual, and in the dead of night the whole side of the mountain came down with a mighty rush, and overwhelmed the sleepers, not one of whom escaped. 2 of the villages were buried, 2 were drowned, for the water of the Cordevole, driven suddenly back, spread out as in the case of the Piave, and formed the lake as we now see it. The 2 buried hamlets lay close under the foot of the mountain at the southern end of the basin, where the great masses of débris now lie piled in huge confusion. Alleghe, the chief place of the district, was situated somewhere about the middle of the lake, and is wholly lost to sight. The 4th village stood on a slope at the north end close against that point where the Cordevole now flows into the lake. 4 more months went by, and then, on the 21st of May, there came a second downfall. This time the waters of the lake were driven up the valley with great violence, and destroyed even more property than before. In the little village which is now called Alleghe, and has been so called ever since the first Alleghe was effaced, the whole east end and choir of the present church were swept away, and the organ was carried to a considerable distance up the glen. At the same moment, for the whole lake seems to have surged up suddenly as one wave, a tree was hurled in through the window of the room in which the Curé was sitting at dinner, and the servant awaiting upon him was killed on the spot. The choir has been rebuilt since then, and the organ, repaired and replaced, does duty to this day. No monument or tablet, so far as I could learn, has ever been erected to the memory of those who perished in these two great disasters, but a catafalque is dressed, and candles are lighted, and a solemn commemorative mass for the souls of the lost and dead is performed in the church at Alleghe on the 21st of May in every year. End of section 17. Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Section 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 7. Caprile, Part 3. We had been told that in winter, when the lake was frozen and the ice not too thick, and in summer on very calm days, the walls and roofs of one of the submerged villages might yet be seen, like the traditional towers of the drowned city of Lyonesse, far down below the surface of the water. An oven and a flight of stone steps, according to one of the young Pessis, were distinctly visible, to say nothing of other less creditable stories. At length, one delicious, idle, sunny afternoon, having nothing of importance to do elsewhere, we took a boat and went out upon the lake, just to test the truth of these traditions with our own eyes. Not a breath stirred when we started from Caprile, but by the time the boat was found and we were embarked in it, a light breeze had sprung up, and the whole surface of the water was in motion. Every moment the breeze freshened and the ripple grew stronger. The withered little old woman and the rosy-cheeked girl who were rowing bent to their oars and pulled with all their might, but having crossed the debouchure of the river, declared themselves unable to pull us round the headland. The water by this time was quite rough, and we landed at the nearest point with difficulty. Scrambling up and along the bank for some distance, we came presently to a kind of little promontory, from whence, notwithstanding the roughness of the water, we could distinctly trace a long reach of wall, and some 3 or 4 square enclosures, evidently the substructures of several houses. "If it had been smooth enough, and we could have rowed over yonder," said the old woman, pointing towards a more distant reach, "the Signoras might have seen the houses with their roofs still on and their chimneys standing. They are all there, deep, deep down." "Have you yourself seen them?" I asked. "Seen them? Signora, I have seen them with these eyes hundreds of times. Dio mio! There are those in Alleghe who have seen stranger sights than I. There are those living who have seen the old parish church with its belfry, all perfect, out yonder in the middle of the lake where it is deep water. There are those living," here her voice dropped to an awe-struck whisper, "who have heard the bells tolling under the water at midnight for the unburied dead." I have told the story of this little expedition out of its due place, in order to bring under one head all that I succeeded in gleaning at various times about the great bergfall of 1771. It certainly did not come off till we had been established for some 2 or 3 weeks at Caprile, and had once or twice been absent upon distant excursions. Our first day at the Pessis was spent in strolling about the neighbourhood, and seeing after mules. Also in getting rid of the 2 Ghedinas who were returning to Cortina with their horses, but not, if we could help it, with their side-saddle. How this delicate and difficult matter was at last negotiated matters little now. Enough that, being simple men with but few words at command, they were ultimately talked out of their convictions, and so departed, leaving the precious object behind them. We promised, of course, to pay for the hire of it; we promised to return it as soon as we succeeded in getting another; we promised everything possible and impossible, and were crowned with that success which is not always the rewards of virtue. "The Padre will be furious with us," said the younger brother somewhat ruefully, as he pocketed his buona mano and turned to leave the room. It occurred to me that this was highly probable, and the Ghedina père might not be altogether a pleasant person to deal with under those circumstances. The poor fellows went away with evident reluctance, followed by Giovanni and the mule. We watched them down the street, and only breathed freely when they were fairly out of sight. That same afternoon, having engaged the exclusive services of a local guide and a couple of mules for as long and as often as we might require them during our sojourn in these parts, we walked to the Col di Santa Lucia, a famous point of view in the neighbouring Val di Fiorentino. Our way thither lay up yesterday's zigzag, a damp, muddy grove wriggling up the face of the steep hillside, about as pleasant to walk in as a marrow spoon, and not much wider. Once we arrived at the top, we left the valley of Andraz upon the left, and turned off towards the right, still, as yesterday, winding along the great pine slopes of Monte Frisolet, but following the eastward instead of the westward face of the mountain. It was uphill nearly all the way. Giuseppe, however, had provided 2 stout alpenstocks of his own cutting, and with this good help we pushed forward rapidly. The path lay half in shade and half in sunshine, commanding now a peep into the depths of the valley below, now a view of the great slide on the opposite shoulder of Monte Fernazza, and now a backward glimpse of the Civita seen above a crowd of intervening hilltops. Thus, at the end of a long pull of rather less than an hour and a half, we found ourselves some 1,500 feet above the level from which we had started, and close upon the Col di Santa Lucia, a curious saddle-backed hill like a lion couchant, keeping guard just at the curve of the Val Fiorentino. His neck is crested with a straggling line of Swiss-looking wooden houses, and his head is crowned by a picturesque little white church. He looks straight down towards the Pelmo, which closes the end of the valley magnificently, like a stupendous castle with twin towers reaching to the clouds. One would like to know what demigod piled those bastions, and why the lion crouched there waiting for ever to spring upon him when he should venture out from his stronghold, and if he is still imprisoned in the heart of the mountain. But the answer to these questions would have to be sought in the cloudland of uncreated myths. Followed by all the children in the place, we made our way into the churchyard, and there, at the extreme end of the little promontory, sat upon the wall to enjoy the view. A glance at the map showed that the Ampezzo Thal lay just beyond the Pelmo, and that we were now looking at the mountain from exactly the reverse side. Seen from over yonder, it had resembled a mighty throne. From here, as I have said, it showed as 2 enormous towers, tawny against the deep blue of the sky. A little white cloud resting lightly against the top of the farthest tower looked like a flag of truce floating from the battlements. Farther to the left, the curved beak of the Antelao, like the prow of a Roman galley, peeped out, faint and distant, above a bank of gathering cumulus. The Val Fiorentino, green and sunny, and sprinkled with white villages, opened up like a beautiful avenue to the very foot of the Pelmo, while northward the valley of Codalungo met the descending slopes of Monte Gusella, and showed a streak of winding path leading down from the path. Travellers who come that way from Cortina instead of by the Tre Sassi have a rugged and somewhat uninteresting road to climb, and, for the sake of this one view which can afterwards be so easily reached from Caprile, lose the scenery of the exquisite upper Val di Cordoval, perhaps the loveliest of all the Dolomite valleys. Turning away at last from the view, we went in search of the house of the Curé of Santa Lucia, upon the outer walls of which, as the story goes, there once existed a fresco by Titian, painted, it was said, in return for the hospitality with which he was entertained there when weather-bound in winter on his way to Venice. Schaubach tells us how it represented Death with his scythe, surrounded by symbols of earthly vanity, and furthermore adds that, having been barbarously whitewashed by some Parocco of the last century, it was with difficulty recovered. Where, however, Mr. Ball and Mr. Gilbert had, as they tell us, both failed, the present writer could scarcely hope for success. A carved stemna, or coat of arms, over a side door was all that the parsonage had to show, and no trace of the fresco was anywhere discernible. I shall not soon forget that evening walk back to Caprile, the golden splendour of the sky, the sweet scent of the new-mown hay. Neither shall I forget the 2 tired pedestrians, all knapsacks, beards, and knickerbockers, making for Caprile, nor the shy little maid in the iron-spiked shoes, timid and silent, keeping goats by the path-side, nor the goats themselves, who had no mauvaise honte and were almost too friendly, nor, above all, that wonderful rose-coloured vision that broke upon us as we turned down again into the valley, that vision of the Civita, looking more than ever like a mighty organ, with its million pipes all gilded in the light of the sunset. The sky above was all light, the wooded hills below were all shade. Monte Pezza, soaring out from a mist of purple haze, caught the rich glow upon its rocky summit. Caprile nestled snugly down in the hollow. The little village of Rocca, high on a green plateau, lifted its slender campanile against the horizon, while yet farther away a couple of tender grey peaks, like hooded nuns, looked up to the eastern sky, as if waiting for the evening star to rise. Then the rose-coloured paled upon the lower crags, and the radiant cloud wreath hovering midway across the face of the Civita like an amber and golden scarf, turned grey and ghost-like. A few moments more, and the last flush faded. The sky turned a tender greenish grey, flecked with golden films. The birds became silent in their nests. The grasshoppers burst into a shrill chorus. The torrent, steel-coloured now, with here and there a gleam of silver, rushed on, singing a wild song, and eager for the sea. Presently a feeble old peasant came across the pine-trunk bridge, staggering under a load of hay that left only his legs visible, and was followed by his wife, a brisk old woman with 5 hats piled upon her head, one on top of another, and a sheaf of rakes and scythes under her arm. So we lingered spellbound, till at last the gloaming came and drove us homeward. Some hours later the clouds that we had seen gathering about the Antelao came up, bringing with them rain and heavy thunder, whereupon the ringers got up and rang the church bells all night long while the storm lasted. End of section 18. And Unfrequented Valleys, section 19. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites, by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 8, At Caprile, Part 1. The good people of Caprile were difficult to please in the matter of weather. The bells having rung all night, the population turned out next morning in solemn procession at 5 a.m. to implore the Virgin's protection against storms. The clouds cleared off accordingly, and a magnificent morning followed the tempest. At midday, however, the procession formed again, and with more ceremony than before, a tall, barefooted contadino in a tumbled supplice coming first, with a huge wooden crucifix, then a shabby priest with his hat on, intoning a litany, then 2 very small and very dirty boys in red capes, carrying unlighted lanthorns on poles. Lastly, a long file of country folks marching 2 and 2, the men first, the women next, the children last, all with their hats in their hands, and all chanting. In this order they wound slowly round the village, beginning at the Contrada di San Marco. "What is the procession for now?" I asked, turning to a respectable-looking peasant who was washing down a cart under an archway. "They are going up to the church to pray for rain, Signora," he replied, pulling off his hat as the procession went by. "But it rained last night," said I, "and this morning you were all praying for fine weather." "Nay, Signora, we prayed this morning against the thunder and lightning, not against the rain," said my peasant gravely. "Oh, I see. You want the rain, but you prefer it without the thunder." "Yes, Signora, we want the rain badly. We have been praying against the drought these 10 days past." "But it seems to me," said I, "that you would waste less time if, instead of praying against the thunder and the lightning and the drought, you just asked the Madonna to put the wind round to the southwest, and send 48 hours of steady rain immediately." The man looked puzzled. "It may be so, Signora," he said apologetically. "The Piraeo settles all that for us. He knows best." The poor fellow looked so humble and so serious that I turned away, quite ashamed of my own levity. After this we had unsettled weather for several days, during which it was invariably fine in the mornings and tempestuous towards night. This being the case, the procession came round quite regularly twice a day, to protest against the storm or the sunshine, according as the skies were foul or fair. Meanwhile the bell ringers must have had a hard time of it, For much to our discomfort, though greatly to the satisfaction of the people of Caprile, the bells were going almost every night. The poor, I found, believed that this pious exercise dispersed the evil spirits of the storm, while the better sort conceived that it occasioned some kind of undulation in the air, and so broke the continuity of the electric fluid. Who would have expected to find these exploded superstitions yet in force in any corner of Europe? It was like being transported back into the Middle Ages. To be condemned to a few days of uncertain weather at Caprile is by no means the worst fate that may befall a traveller in these parts. The place is full of delightful walks, all near enough to be enjoyed between the last shower and the next, of woods and glens, and pastures rich in wild flowers, of easy hills for those who love climbing, of shade for the student, of trout for the angler, of ferns for the botanist. In a lovely little ravine among overhanging firs and mossy nooks of rock, not a quarter of a mile from the village, L. found specimens of the Cystopterus fragilis, Cystopterus alpina, Asplenium septentrionale, and several varieties of maidenhair. And for the matter of sketching, a subject starts up before one at every turn of the path. Nor does one, as in too many Dolomite villages and valleys, pay the penalty of starvation in exchange for all these pleasures. The food is very fairly good, and Madame Pézy's cooking unexceptionable. Beef, even though disguised in cinnamon, is welcome after a long and fatiguing course of veal cutlet. The salmon trout of Alleghe is excellent. The bread, the wild strawberries, the rich mountain cream are all quite delicious, and even vegetables are not wholly unknown. Then, besides the walks, and the ferns, and the sketching, Caprile, like almost every Italian place, has its special characteristics, its local curiosities, its own little root of medieval history, and these are things that do not come out unless one happens to be idling about for a few days, talking to the people, making friends with the Parocco, and borrowing all the dusty old vellum-bound books in the place. In this way we light upon a few odd scraps of fact, more interesting to pick up, perhaps, than to relate. Thus we learned that there were great iron mines once at the Col di Santa Lucia, that both Alleghe and Caprile were famous for their skilled ironsmiths and armourers, and that they used to supply knives and swords to Venice. That exquisite old bronze door-handle wrought in the form of a mermaid, and that twisted hammer beaten out of one solid piece, which I admired so much yesterday on the door of yonder dilapidated stone house at the farther end of the village, came probably from some anvil now buried at the bottom of the lake. There were 40 mines once, they say, in the province of Belluno, where now only 4 are in operation. The old name of Caprile was Pagus Gabrielis. I could not learn that any inscriptions, urns, or mosaics had ever been found here, as at Longarone and Castellavazzo, so that the ancient Latin name seems to be the only Roman relic left. Towards the middle of the 15th century, the men of Caprile and Cadore united their political fortunes and placed themselves under the protection of Venice, whereupon the Republic appointed them a governor with the title of Captain General. It was one of these captains who erected the column of St. Mark yonder, at the extreme end of the village. At this time Caprile was a flourishing commercial centre, and the chief commune in these valleys. Among the natural curiosities of the place, they point you out a small hole in the face of a neighbouring rock, and tell you it is the mouth of a spring impregnated with sulphuretted hydrogen, once worked to some profit, but now abandoned. We also heard of the recent discovery of a vein of fine alabaster at a place called Di Janera, a little farther up the valley, said to equal in quality the best alabaster of Tuscany. Then, too, there is the dialect, unaccountably smacking of French in a country locked in between Venetia and Austria. Almost every little separate pays in these parts has its own vocabulary, and an enthusiast like Professor Max Müller might doubtless, by means of a comparative analysis of these 101 dialectic varieties, extract all kinds of interesting philological flies in amber. More curious, however, than any fact having to do with Caprile is the history of Rocca, a small village perched upon a hill just against the mouth of the Val Pettorina and fronting the precipitous northern face of Monte Pezza. This tiny place, known in the Middle Ages as Rocca di Pietore or Rocca Bruna, if never in the strictest sense of the word a republic, was at all events self-governed, owing only a nominal allegiance to the Archdeacon of Capodistria, and enjoying a special immunity from tax, impost, or personal service (imposta occulta o fazioni personali). This interesting little community, consisting of 45 families, the men of which were nearly all armourers, was constrained in A.D. 1389 to acknowledge the suzerainty of the Visconti, who placed it under the jurisdiction of the Bellunese. Not even so, however, would Rocca resign its cherished liberties, but stipulated that all the articles of its ancient statutes should be observed inviolate. The manuscript original of this remarkable document, drawn out in 66 clauses and registered at Belluno in the year 1418, is now in the possession of Signora Pezzia of Caprile. When by and by the Visconti attempted to levy a tax upon their steelwork, the men of Rocca rebelled, and later still, in A.D. 1659, being then subject to the Venetians and jealous as ever of their privileges, they dispatched an ambassador to the Senate, reminding that august body how, being situated on the frontier and exposed to the attacks of enemies beyond the border, the people of Rocca had at all times testified to their patriotism with their blood, and preserved intact those privileges which were dearer to them than the pupils of their eyes. In all but name a republic, this little free state, smaller than either Marino or Andorra, finally lost its independence when ceded to the Austrians with the rest of Lombardo-Venetia in 1814. It now ranks as an ordinary parish in the district of Belluno. Its castle has disappeared, and only 4 roofless walls of rough masonry in a green meadow at the foot of the hill on the side next Caprile remain to mark the site of its former municipal palace. It is an ugly, gabled-ended ruin, and it looks like the shell of a small church. In the way of local notabilities, Rocca has its painter, one Domenico di Biasio, whose works are supposed to have merit, while Caprile rejoices in a certain Padre Barnabas of the Capuchin order, famous for the eloquence of his sermons, which have been published in Belluno. Having neither seen the paintings nor read the sermons, I am unable to pronounce upon the excellence of either. End of section 19. An Unfrequented Valleys, section 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites, by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 8. At Caprile, Part 2. The 2 really remarkable natural curiosities of the place, however, are the gorge of Sottoguda and the Sasso di Ronch. Every visitor to Caprile is shown the first. We, I believe, were the first travellers who ever took the trouble to go up in search of the second. The gorge of Sottoguda, a deep, narrow cleft between overhanging cliffs, distant about 4½ or 5 miles from Caprile, is in fact the upper end of the Val Pettorina, which here creeps between the lower spurs of Monte Guda and the Monte Foi. It is neither so narrow nor so dark nor so deep down as Pfeffers or Trient, but it reminds one of both, and, though on a smaller scale, is very fine and curious in its way. That the whole gorge is a mere crack in the rocks produced by some prehistoric natural convulsion is evident at first sight. I even fancied that I could see how, in certain places, the rent cliffs might have been fitted together again like the pieces of a child's puzzle. The length of the gorge, which wriggles in and out like a serpent, is rather more than a half-mile, windings included. Within this short distance the torrent that flows through it is crossed by 17 bridges of rough pine trunks. So abrupt are the turns and sinuosities, that never more than 2 of these bridges are visible at the same time, and sometimes the traveller who is only one bridge in advance is entirely lost sight of by his companions. The torrent roars along in great force, and is echoed and re-echoed in a deafening way from the cliffs on either side. The gorge is in many places not more than 12 feet wide. The precipices, at a rough guess, rise to a height of about 600 or 700 feet. The scale, after all, is not gigantic, but the light and shadow come in grandly at certain hours, throwing one side of the defile into brilliant sunshine and the other into profoundest gloom, with an effect never to be obtained in either Pfeffers or Trient. We first saw Sottoguda on a showery afternoon when the lights were unusually shifting and beautiful, and all the trees and bushes overhead, and all the rich red and brown and golden mosses on the rocks and boulders down below, were sparkling with raindrops. A woman standing on a slender bridge formed of a single pine trunk thrown across a rift of rock some 300 feet above our heads, looked down, knitting, as we wound in and out among the bridges and rapids. She smiled and spoke, but the roar of the water was such that we could not hear her. We saw the motion of her lips, and that was all. Presently a little white goat came and thrust its head forward from behind her skirts, and also peered down upon the wayfarers below. The blue sky and the green bushes framed them round, and made a picture not soon to be forgotten. Most travellers see Sottoguda from Caprile, but it is approached to more advantage from the side of the Fedaya Pass, and should, if possible, be first taken from that direction. Those, however, who are not equal to the fatigue of crossing the pass, may go to Sottoguda and back from Caprile in about 3 hours with mules, or 4 hours on foot. To go to the Sasso di Ronch, however, takes quite half a day. It is a very curious spot, and one of which the writer may claim to be in a very small way the discoverer. Wandering about as usual before breakfast the first morning after our arrival in Caprile, and taking the road towards Alleghe, I observed a strange, solitary chimney of rock standing out against the sky, high upon the sloping shoulder of Monte Mignon, about 2,000 feet above the level of the valley. Seen from below, it had apparently no thickness proportionate to its height and breadth, and looked like a gigantic paper knife stuck upright in a bed of green sward. A few trees and a couple of chalets nestled at the foot of this eccentric object, and scaling it by these, I concluded that it could not measure less than 250 feet from base to summit. I had come out that morning to see the Civita, but having taken a long look at that queen of Dolomites, I nevertheless sat down there and then upon a big boulder in a flood of burning sunshine, and, with the help of an opera glass, sketched the Sasso di Ronch. From that moment I was tormented by the desire to see it more nearly. There were houses up there, so it was fair to conclude there must also be a path, and of the view it must command in at least 2 directions there could be no doubt. Giuseppe, however, knew nothing about it, and none of the Pezzis had ever taken the trouble to go higher than Rocca, or Laste, or the cross on the brink of the cliff about half-way between the two, where strangers are taken to see the view over the Civita. "There is nothing up yonder," said young Signora Pezzì, contemptuously. "Nothing but an old stone and a couple of poor cottages." But the old stone had fastened our imaginations, so one fine morning we sent for Clementi and the mules, and started upon our voyage of discovery. Clementi must be introduced. Clementi and the mules. Clementi is our Caprile guide. He either belongs to the mules or the mules belong to him; it is impossible to say which. One mule is black, the other white, and both are named Nessol, which is perplexing. Fair Nessol is L's mule, a gentle beast, weak but willing, given to stopping and staring at the landscape in a meditative way, but liable to odd and sometimes inconvenient prejudices. Yesterday he objected to bridges, which in the gorge of Sottoguda was particularly awkward. To-day he suddenly abhors everything black, and kicks up his heels at the curé before we are out of the village. Dark Nessol, being bigger and stronger, is assigned to me. He is a self-sufficient brute, one who, in the matter of roads and turnings, invariably prefers his own opinion to that of his rider. His appetite is boundless, omnivorous, insatiable. He not only steals the young corn by the roadside and the flowers inside garden fences, but he eats poison berries, chicken bones, bark, egg shells, and potato parings. He would eat the Encyclopaedia Britannica if it came his way. Elle and her mule are the best friends in the world. She feeds him perpetually with sugar, and he follows her about like a dog. My mule and I, on the contrary, never arrive at terms of intimacy. Perhaps he knows that I am the heavier weight, and resents me accordingly. Perhaps he dislikes the society of ladies, and prefers carrying half-ton loads of hay and charcoal, which is the sort of thing he has been brought up to do. At all events, he refuses from the first to make himself agreeable. Both mules, however, do their work carefully, and climb like cats upon occasion. Clementi is a native of Caprile, and lodges with his old mother on the ground floor of a big stone house in the middle of the village. He is a short, active, sturdy, black-eyed little fellow, hot-tempered, ready-witted, merry, untiring, full of animation and gesture, with an honest bulldog face and an eye that is always laughing. He wears his trousers tucked up around the ankles, a bunch of cock's feathers in his hat, and a bottle slung over his shoulder. It is impossible to look at him without being reminded of the clown in a Christmas pantomime. Such is Clementi, the very antipodes of Giuseppe, whom I described long since. With these two men and these two mules we travelled henceforth as long as we remained among the Dolomites. Setting off that bright July morning for the Sasso di Ronch, our way lies at first in the direction of Rocca. The path, however, turns aside at the ruins of the old municipal palace, and bears away to the right, striking up at once through the fir woods, which on this side clothe the lower slopes of the Monte Migion. Thus, in an alternating shade and sunshine, it winds and mounts as far as the cross, a point of view on the giddy edge of an abrupt precipice facing the south. The cliff here goes down sheer to the valley, 1,000 feet or more, and Clementi tells how the cross was put there, not to mark the point of view for Messieurs les étrangers, but to commemorate the death of a poor little goat-herd only 11 years of age, who, going in search of a stray kid, fell over, and was dashed to pieces before he reached the bottom. The view from here is fine, considering at what a moderate elevation we stand. The Civita rises before us, grandly displayed; 5 valleys open away beneath our feet, and the slated roofs of Caprile and Rocca glisten in the morning sunshine hundreds of feet below. A greenish-blue corner of the lake gleams just beyond the last curve of the Val del Leghi, while, between that point and this, there extend, distance beyond distance, the fir woods, the pastures, and the young corn slopes of Monte Pezza. From hence, a better path winds round toward the north-east in the direction of Lasté, a small white village on a mountain ledge high above the valley, looking straight over towards Buchenstein. From here the grey old castle on its pedestal of crag, the green valley of Andraz, and the mountains of the Tre Sassi Pass are all visible; but the main feature of the view on this side is the Pelmo, just as the main feature of the view on the other side is the Civita. Seen through a gap in the mountains, it rises magnificently against the horizon, looking more than ever like a gigantic fortress. I have called the Civita the Queen of Dolomites, and so, in like manner, I would call the Pelmo King. The one is all grace and symmetry, the other all massiveness and strength. It is possible to associate the idea of fragility with the Civita; it is possible to conceive how that exquisite perpendicular screen, with its thousands of slender pilasters and pinnacles, might be shivered by any great convulsion of nature; but the Pelmo looks as if rooted in the heart of the great globe itself, immovable till the day of the last disruption. For a distant view, this of the Pelmo from near Lasté on Monte Migion is the grandest with which I am acquainted. From this point we next struck up across a green slope wooded like an English park, and so came out upon another path, steep and stony and glaring, which led to the cottages that I had seen from the valley. A woman scouring a brass pan at the spring, and 2 others turning the yellow flax upon the hillside, stopped in their work to stare in speechless wonder. The children shouted and ran indoors as if we were goblins. We stayed a moment at the spring to fill our water flasks and let the mules drink. "Have you never seen any ladies up here before?" laughed Clementi. "Never!" said one of the women, throwing up her hands emphatically. "Never! What have they come for?" We explained that our object was to see and sketch the Sasso up yonder. Il Sasso? She repeated, half incredulously. Il Sasso? She evidently thought us quite demented. Another bit of rough path, another turn, and the great paper knife rock, like a huge, solitary menhir, is nodding over our heads. It looks even bigger than I had expected, bigger and thinner, but also more shapeless and less interesting. It is a marvel that the first high wind should not blow it down instantly, but then it had this effect from below. "Don't you think we have taken a great deal of trouble for nothing?" says L. in a tone of disappointment. I would not acknowledge it for worlds, but I have been thinking so myself for some minutes. I push on, however, turn another corner, and arriving at the top of the col, come suddenly upon a most unexpected and fantastic scene, a scene as of a mountain in ruins. For not only is the whole appearance of the Sasso changed in the strangest way by being seen in profile, but behind the ridge on which the Sasso stands there is revealed a vast circular amphitheatre, like the crater of an extinct volcano, strewn with rent crags, precipices riven from top to bottom, and enormous fragments of rock, many of which are at least as big as the clock tower at Westminster. All these are piled one upon another in the wildest confusion, all are prostrate, save one gigantic needle which stands upright in the midst of the circle, like an iceberg turned to stone. What was the nature of this great catastrophe, and when did it happen? It could not have been a bergfall, for the mountain slopes above are all grassy Alp, and the very summit of Monte Mignon is a space of level pasture. It could not have been an eruption, for these fragments are pure Dolomite limestone, and Dolomite, it is now agreed, is not volcanic. Unable even to form a guess as to the cause of this great ruin, I can only say that, to my unscientific eyes, it looks exactly as if a volcano had burst up beneath a Dolomite summit and blown it into 1,000 fragments like a mine. End of section 20. Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Section 21. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 8. At Caprile, Part 3. Meanwhile, here, on the ridge, apart and alone, like a solitary remnant of outer battlement left standing beside a raised fortress, rises to a height of at least 250 feet above the grass at its base, the Sasso di Ronch. Seen thus in profile, it is difficult to believe that it is the same Sasso di Ronch which one has been looking at from below. It looks a mere aiguille or spiral, disproportionately slender for its height, and curved at the top, as if just ready to pitch over. Some one has compared the Matterhorn to the head and neck of a war-horse, rearing up behind the valley of Zermatt. So might the Sasso di Ronch, from this point, be compared to the head and neck of a giraffe. Standing upon its knife-edge of ridge, all precipice below, all sky above, the horizon one long sweep of jagged peaks, it makes as wild and weird a subject as I ever sat down to sketch, before or since. Thus the morning passes. At noon we rest in the shade of the Sasso to eat our frugal luncheon of bread and hard-boiled eggs; then, being refreshed, pack up the sketching traps and prepare to go home. It is not long, however, before we call another halt, this time in the midst of a beautiful open glade a little way below the cottages. Here, framed in by a foreground of velvet turf, a chalet and a group of larches, and only divided from us by the misty abyss of the Val Pettorina, rise the vertical cliffs and craggy summits of Monte Pezza. It is a ready-made sketch, and must be seized on the spot. "There ought to be a fine view from that point yonder," I remark, mixing a pale little pool of cobalt, like a solution of turquoises, and addressing myself to no one in particular. Hereupon Clementi, apropos, as it would seem, of nothing, says briskly, "Would the Signoras like to make a first ascent?" A first ascent, I repeated vaguely, adding a softening drop of brown madder, and so turning the whole pool into a tender pearly grey. What do you mean? I mean, would the Signoras like to be the first to mount to the top of the Sasso Bianco? The Sasso Bianco, says L., beginning to be interested in the conversation. Where is the Sasso Bianco? Clementi points to my sketch and then to the mountain opposite. But that is the Monte Pezza, I exclaim. Scusate, Signora, the Sasso Bianco is the summit of the Monte Pezza. No traveller has ever been up there. It is new, new, new. How can it be new? I ask incredulously. It is not a very high mountain. Scusate ancora, Signora. It is not a mountain of the first class, but it is high, very high for a mountain of the second class. It is higher than either the Frisolet, the Fernazza, or the Mignon. Still, it is much less difficult than the Civita, and the Civita has been ascended several times. How then should the Sasso Bianco have escaped till now? Because, Signora, the Sasso Bianco is too difficult for ordinary travellers, and not difficult enough for the Club Alpino, replies Clementi oracularly. Il bal, il tucket, il Whitwell care nothing for a mountain which they can swallow at one mouthful. This sounds logical. I begin to look at my mountain with more respect, and to take extra pains with my sketch. At the same time, I venture to remind Clementi that L. and I are only ordinary travellers, and, as such, might find the Sasso Bianco too tough to be swallowed, even in many mouthfuls. But he will not listen to this view of the question for a moment. If we choose to do it, we have but to say so. He will undertake that the Signoras shall go up pulito. The sketch being by this time finished, we go down, talking always of the Sasso Bianco. Clementi is eager for us to achieve the honour of a prima ascensione, and advocates it with all his eloquence. Giuseppe, anxious that we should attempt nothing in excess of our strength, listens gravely, puts in a question here and there, and reserves his opinion. According to Clementi, nothing can be finer than the view or easier than the ascent, but then he admits that he himself has never been higher than the upper pastures, and has never seen the view he praises so highly. Still, he has gone far enough to survey the ground. He knows that we can certainly ride as far as the last group of chalets, and he is confident that the walk to the summit cannot be difficult. On the whole, the thing sounds tempting. Our plans, however, are already laid out for a long excursion to be begun, weather permitting, tomorrow. So the subject of the Sasso Bianco, having been discussed, is for the present dismissed. Dismissed, but not forgotten. Those words, prima ascensione, are cabalistic, and haunt the memory strangely. They invest the Monte Pezza with a special and peculiar interest, so that it is no longer as other mountains are, but seems henceforth to have a halo around its summit. But I must not forget the old peasant whom we met a little way below the Gothard's Cross, as we went down that afternoon. He was a fine old man, still handsome, dressed in a new suit of homespun frieze, and evidently well-to-do. He was sitting by the path-side. A basket and a long stick lay beside him. As we drew near, he rose and bowed; so being on foot, the men and mules following at a distance, we stopped to speak to him. He, of course, immediately asked where we had been, and where we were going. These are the invariable questions. I said that we had been up to the Sasso di Ronch. "To the Sasso?" he repeated. "Ah, you have been up to the Sasso? Did you see the ruins of the castle?" I replied that, not knowing there were ruins, we had looked for nothing of the kind. "Aye," he said, shaking his head, "and unless you knew where to find them, you would never notice them. But they are there. I have seen them myself many a time, when I was younger and could climb like you." "Do you know to whom the castle belonged?" "Si, si, si. Lo penso bene. Will the Signoras be pleased to sit, while I tell them all about it?" With this, he resumed his seat on the grassy bank, wiped his brow with his handkerchief, and talked away with the air of one who was accustomed to be listened to. The castle, he said, was built by the Visconti, the cruel Visconti of Milan. They erected it towards the close of the 14th century, to overawe the Repubblica of Rocca, over which they then exercised a nominal sovereignty. But when the rule of the Visconti came to an end, the Brava Commune, fearing lest the nobles of Belluno should seize and occupy this stronghold to the ruin of the people, pulled it down, leaving scarce one stone standing upon another. That was between 4 and 5 centuries ago. Then the nobles of Belluno, finding they could obtain no footing on the mountain, went and built the castle of Andres up yonder on the valley of Buchenstein, and there made themselves a terror to all the country. Had the Signora seen the castle of Andres? Oh well, that too was now a ruin, pulled down by the French in 1866, according to international treaty. As for the Antico Castello up by the Sasso, it was like an old tree of which the trunk was cut down, and only the roots left. Nothing remained of it but the foundations. Being built of rock, they looked so like the rock that you might pass them 100 times without observing them. There were not many people now living, he said, who knew where to look for them. When he was a young man, the contadini used to go up and dig there for hidden treasure, but they always had been frightened away by the demons. The ruins were full of demons underground, in the subterraneous dungeons, the entrances to which were now lost. They were wont to appear in the form of snakes, and they raised terrible storms of wind and thunder to drive away those who sought to discover the secrets of the ruin. Had he ever seen the demons himself? Why, no, he could not say that he had, for he had never cared to tempt the devil by going to dig for treasure, but he had seen and heard the tempest raging up there, about the top of the mountain, many and many a time, when it was fair weather down in the valley. And he had once known a man who went up at midnight on the eve of Santo Giovanni, to dig in a certain spot where he had dreamed he should find buried gold. When he had dug a deep hole, ecco, his spade struck against an earthen spot, and he thought his fortune was made. But when he took the lid off the pot, there came out only 5 small black snakes, no bigger than your finger. At this sight, being both alarmed and disappointed, he up with his spade and cut one of these little snakes in twain, and lo, in one instant the hole that he had dug was full of snakes, big, black, venomous, twisted, hissing snakes, thousands and thousands of them, all pouring out upon him in a hideous throng, so that he had to fly for his life, and only escaped death by a miracle. "But has nothing ever been found in the ruins?" I asked, when at the end of this story the old man paused to take breath. "Nothing but rubbish, Signora," he replied. "A few small coins, a rusty cask or two, some fragments of armour, niente più." He would have talked for an hour if we could have stayed to listen to him, but we were in haste, and now wished him good day. So he rose again, took off his hat, and in quaint, set terms wished us good health, a pleasant journey, a safe return, and the blessing of God. The rest of that afternoon was spent in laying out our route by the map, unpacking and selecting stores, and endeavouring to solve the oft-propounded problem of how to get the contents of a large portmanteau into a small black bag. For the days of carretti, landaus, and carriage roads were over. Henceforth our ways would lie among mountain paths and unfrequented mule tracks, and tomorrow we must start upon an expedition of at least 10 days, with only as much luggage as each could carry packed behind her own saddle. Giuseppe, it was arranged, should carry the sketching traps, and Clementi the provision basket. In this order we were to take a long round, beginning with Cencenighe and Agordo, going thence to Primario, Paneveggio, and Predazzo, and coming home by Campidello and the Fedaja pass. In the meanwhile L.'s maid was to be left in charge of the rooms and under the kindly care of the Pezzis. End of section 21. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Section 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 9. To Agordo and Primiero, Part 1. Having risen literally with the dawn, we are on the road next morning before 6, bound for Agordo. The Pezzis gather about the house door to see us off. The Austrian officer who lodges over the way, and soothes his customs-laden soul by perpetually torturing a cracked zitter, leans out in his shirt-sleeves from a second-floor window to see us mount. He is already smoking his second, if not his third meerschaum, and only pauses now and then to twirl his moustache with that air of serene contempt for everyone but himself which so eminently distinguishes him. It takes some little time to strap on the bags, to say good-bye, and to induce dark Nessel to receive me upon any terms. He has a hypocritical way of standing quite still till the very moment Giuseppe is about to put me up, and then suddenly ducks away, to my immense discomfiture and the undisguised entertainment of the neighbourhood. When this performance has been repeated some 6 or 7 times, he is hustled into a corner and pinned against the wall by main force, while I mount ignominiously at last by the help of a chair. The road to Sansaniga lies by way of Alleghe, so that for the first 5 miles or so it is all familiar ground. The air feels fresh, but the sky is already one blaze of cloudless sunlight. The Civita rises before us in shadowy splendor. The larks are singing as I had thought they never sang anywhere save on the Campagna, between Rome and Tivoli. Between 40 and 50 bronzed and bare-legged peasants are collecting floating timber this morning at the head of the lake. Some wade, some pilot rough rafts of tree trunks loosely lashed together, some stand on the banks and draw the logs to shore by means of long boat-hooks. One active fellow sits his pine trunk as if it were a horse, and paddles it to shore with uncommon dexterity. The whole scene is highly picturesque and amusing, and the men, with their shirt-sleeves rolled above their elbows, and their trousers above their knees, look just like Neapolitan fishermen. Every now and then they all join in a shrill, prolonged cry, which adds greatly to the wildness of the effect. Skirting the borders of the lake, we draw nearer every moment to the lower cliffs of the Civita, and arrive at the scene of the great bergfall of 1771, a wilderness of fallen rocks, like the battle-ground of the Titans. Somewhere beneath these mountains of débris lie the 2 buried villages. No one any longer remembers exactly where they stood, nor even which of the 4 they were. That Alleghe lay near the middle of the present water seems to be the only fact about which everyone is confident. A solitary white house, half podere, half albergo, stands on a hill just above the point where the Cordevole, swelled by all the torrents of the Civita, rushes out at the lower end of the lake and pours impetuously down the steep and narrow gorge leading to Sansaniga. Here the path, after being carried for a long way high on the mountain-side, gradually descends to the level of the river, crossing and recrossing it continually by means of picturesque wooden bridges. Here, too, an adder, sunning itself on a heap of stones by the wayside, wriggles away at our approach, and is speedily killed by Clementi, who skips about and flourishes his stick like a maniac. Meanwhile a tremendous south-west wind blows up the gorge like a hurricane, without in any way mitigating the pitiless blaze of the sun overhead, or the glare which is flung up at a white heat from the road underfoot. At length, about 10:30 a.m., we arrive in sight of Sansaniga, a small village in the open flat just between the Val Cordevole and the Val di Canali. The Monte Pelsa, which is in fact a long, wild buttress of the Civita, the Cima di Pape, a volcanic peak 8,239 feet in height, and the southward ridge of the Monte Pezza, enclose it in a natural amphitheatre, the central area of which is all fertile meadowland traversed by long lines of feathery poplars. Putting up here for a couple of hours at a poor little inn in the midst of the village, we are glad to take refuge from the wind and sun in a stuffy upstairs room, while the men dine and the mules feed, and where we take luncheon. One soon learns not rashly to venture on strange meats and drinks in these remote villages. We now habitually provide ourselves before starting in the morning with fresh bread and hard-boiled eggs, and so, on arriving at a new place, ask only for cheese, wine, and a fresh lettuce from the garden. The cheese is not often very palatable, and we generally give the wine to the men, but as something must be ordered and paid for, the purpose is answered. When we are unusually tired or minded to indulge in luxuries, we light the Etna and treat ourselves to Liebig soup or tea. Beyond Cencenighe the character of the scenery changes suddenly. It is still the Val Cordevole, but is wholly unlike its former pastoral self, either above or below Caprile. Barren precipices, scarred by 1,000 bergfalls, close in the narrow way. Fallen boulders of enormous bulk lie piled everywhere in grand and terrible confusion, while the road is again and again cut through huge barricades of solid débris. Frequent wayside crosses repeat the old tragic story of sudden death. The torrent, chafed and tormented by 1,000 obstacles, rages below. Wild Dolomitic peaks start up here and there, are seen for a moment, and then vanish. A blind beggar-woman curled up with her crutches in the recesses of a painted shrine by the roadside uplifts a wailing voice at our approach. All is mournful, all is desolate. By and by the gorge widens, the great twin towers of Monte Lucano and the splintered peaks of Monte Pise come into sight, and, like a rapid change of scene upon a mighty stage, a sunny Italian valley, rich in vines and chestnuts and fields of Indian corn, opens out before us. From thence the road, winding now in shade, now in sunshine, traverses a country which would be as thoroughly southern as the inland parts about Naples, were it not that the houses in every little village are decorated in the Tyrolean way, with half-obliterated frescoes of Madonnas and saints. Large rambling farmhouses, built over gloomy arches, peopled by pigs, poultry, and children, enliven the landscape with an air of slovenly prosperity, quite Campanian. A wayside osteria hangs out the traditional withered bough, and announces in letters a foot long, Buon'acqua gratis e vendita di buon vino. Good water for nothing, and good wine for sale. By and by a scattered town, and an important new-looking church and a dome and 2 small cupolas come into sight at the far end of the valley. This is Agordo, an archdeaconry, and the capoluogo, or chief place of the district. 2 long, last sultry miles of dusty flat, and we are there. A large albergo at the upper end of the piazza is as big at least as Trafalgar Square, and receives us on arrival. A pretentious, comfortless place, with an arcade and a café on the ground floor, and no end of half-furnished upper rooms. Being ushered upstairs by a languid damsel with an enormous chignon, for there seems to be neither master, mistress, nor waiter about the place, we take possession of a whole empty floor looking to the front, and ask, of course, the tired traveller's first question: What can we have for dinner? The answer to this inquiry comes in astounding form of a regular bill of fare. We can have anything from soup to ices if we choose, so, in an evil hour, we order a real dinner, to consist of several courses, including trout and a boiled chicken. We even talk vaguely of spending a day or 2 in Agordo for the longer enjoyment of such luxurious quarters. In the meantime, having rested, we stroll out to see the town. Strange to say, there is no town, there is only the piazza. Houses enough there may be possibly to make a town, if one could only bring them together and arrange them within reasonable limits, but here they show as a mere brick-and-mortar fringe, thinly furnishing 3 sides of a great desolate enclosure, where all the children and all the stray dogs and all the palo players must do congregate. 3 sides only, for the 4th is wholly occupied by Count Manzoni's dilapidated villa, with its unpainted shutters, its curtainless windows, and its outside multitude of 10th-rate gods and goddesses, which crowd the skyline of the façade like an army of acrobats and ballet girls in stone. The church, a modern work in the Renaissance style designed by Segusini, stands near the hotel at the upper or eastern end of the piazza. The door being open, we lift the heavy leathern curtain and walk in, but it is like walking into chaos and old night. Every blind is down, every avenue is closed against the already fading daylight. A Capuchin monk and some 3 or 4 women kneel here and there, more shadowy than the shadows. A lamp burns dimly before the high altar, a few tapers flare before the shrine of the Madonna, faint gleams of gilding, outlines of frescoes, of altarpieces, of statues are indistinctly visible. To gain any idea of the decorations, or even of the proportions of the church, is so impossible that we defer it altogether till tomorrow, and make instead the tour of the piazza. Having done this, and having peeped into a very narrow, dirty, back street running up the hill behind the town, we come home being the albergo of the Miniere, to dinner. And here I should observe that the house is so called after the copper, lead, and zinc mines that form the commercial treasure of the district. These mines, lying at the mouth of the Val Imperina, about 2 miles from Agordo, belonged formerly to the Republic of Venice, and are now government property. Of the wealth of their resources there seems to be but one opinion. Yet the works are carried on so parsimoniously that the net profit seldom exceeds 500,000 lire, or about 2,000 English, per pound. A quicksilver mine near Gosalda, about 6 miles off in another direction, worked by a private company, is reported to pay better. Did I say that we came home to dinner? Ah well, it was a sultry, languid evening, there was thunder in the air, and happily we were not very hungry. I will not dwell upon the melancholy details. Enough if I observe that the boiled chicken not only came to the table in its headdress of feathers like an African chief in grande tenue, but also with its internal economy quite undisturbed. The rest of the dishes were conceived and carried out in the same spirit. Non ragonum de lor, etc., etc. For my own part, I believe to this day that the cook was a raving maniac. That dream of spending a day or 2 at Agordo vanished in the course of dinner. We resolved to push on as quickly as possible for Primiero, and so, as soon as the cloth was removed, sent for Giuseppe and ordered the mules to be at the door by 6:30 the next morning. That night there came a tremendous storm, the heaviest we had yet had. It began suddenly with a peal of thunder just over the roof of the hotel, and then continued to lighten and thunder incessantly for more than half an hour before any rain fell. The lightning seemed to run slantwise along the clouds in jagged streams, and to end each time with a plunge straight down into the earth. These streams of electric fluid were in themselves blinding white, but the light they flashed over the landscape was of a brilliant violet, as rich in colour as a burst of Bengal light. I never saw anything to equal the vividness of that violet light, or the way in which it not only stripped the darkness from the great mountains on the opposite side of the valley, but brought out with intense distinctness every separate leaf upon the trees, every tile upon the farthest housetops, and every blade of grass in the piazza below. These flashes for the first 10 minutes followed each other at intervals of not longer than 15 seconds, and sometimes at intervals of 5, so that it almost seemed as if there were flashes of darkness as well as flashes of light. The church bells, as usual, were rung as long as the storm lasted, but the thunder peals overlapped each other so continually, and were echoed and re-echoed in such a grand way from the amphitheatre of mountains round about, that one only heard them now and then for a moment. By and by, at the end of perhaps 40 minutes, there came a deafening final explosion, as if a mountain had blown up, and after that heavy rain, and only rain, till about 2 o'clock a.m. At 6:30, however, when we rode out of Agordo, the weather was as brilliant as ever. Long fleets of white clouds were sailing overhead before the wind. The air had that delicious freshness that follows a thunderstorm in summer. The trees, the grass, the wildflowers, even the mountains looked as if their colours had just been dashed with a wet brush, and so left for the sun to dry them. Our way lay across the Cordevole bridge, and then up a steep path, very narrow, partly paved, and shaded on both sides by barberry bushes, wild briars all in bloom, and nut trees already thick with clusters of new fruit. Monte Lucano, in form like a younger brother of the Pelmo, towered high into the morning mists on the one hand, and the wild peaks of Monte Pizz and Monte Agnera peered out fitfully now and then upon the other. Thus we reached and passed Voltago, a picturesque village surrounded by green fir woods and slopes of Indian corn. In the valley below gleamed Agordo with its white dome, and against the eastern horizon rose the pinky peaks of Monte Lastier, the shadowy ridge of Monte Premper, and the strange, solitary needle called the Gusella di Vescova, like a warning finger pointing to the sky. Next came a cherry country, thick with orchards full of scarlet fruit, then a romantic ravine called the Val Molina, then the scattered village of Fresene, with its little church in the midst of a mountain prairie, surrounded by fir woods. Who would dream of finding a pianoforte manufactory in such a lost corner of the hills, or a maker of violins and contrabassi a little way lower down at Voltago? Yet at Fresene, one Giuseppe dalla Lucia turns out pianos of respectable repute, and the fiddles, little and big, of Valentino Conadora of Voltago, are said to be of unusual excellence. And now, as we ride across this space of pleasant meadowland, the mists part suddenly overhead, and reveal a startling glimpse of three enormous pallid obelisks, apparently miles high against the blue. These are the peaks of the Sasso di Campo, one of the Primiero giants, as yet unascended, and estimated by Ball at something little short of 10,000 feet above the level of the sea. The mists part and close again, the peaks stand out for one moment in brilliant sunshine, and then melt like things of air. It is our first and last sight of the Sasso di Campo. The path, always rising, now winds through a wooded district, stony but shady, the haunt of gorgeous butterflies. Higher still, it becomes a tunnel of greenery, only just wide and high enough for man and mule. The larches meet and rustle overhead, tiny falls trickle deliciously from rock to rock, and gush every now and then across the path, while the banks on each side are tapestried all over with rich mosses, wild strawberries, and pendant festoons of osmunda oak and beech ferns. If the footway were not so steep and slippery, and the work so heavy for the mules, no place could be imagined more delicious on a day like this, for it grows hotter every hour as the sun climbs and the vapours roll away. But the pull is too long and too difficult, and the path in many places resolves itself into a mere broken staircase of wet rock, up which the two Nessols, though riderless, clamber and struggle with the utmost difficulty. End of section 22. And Unfrequented Valleys, section 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites. Chapter 9, To Agordo and Primiero, Part 2. At length one last great step is surmounted, and an immense park-like plateau scattered over with clumps of larches and firs, threaded by numberless tiny torrents, and radiant with wildflowers, opens away for miles before our eyes like a rolling sea of rich green sward. This is the summit of the Gosalda Pass. The village of Gosalda, a rambling hamlet lying high on the mountain-side, facing Monte Pizzon, Monte Prebello, and the valley of the Mies, is reached about 2 miles farther on. Here we put up for the regular midday rest at a very humble little albergo, where, however, we are well content to take possession of a clean landing, a deal table, a couple of wooden chairs, and an open window commanding a magnificent view over the valley and the mountains beyond. We asked, as usual, for bread, cheese, and wine, explaining that the wine is for the men, and that we require teacups and spoons for ourselves. But the landlady, a stupid, civil body with a goitre, shakes her head and stands bewildered. "Taza?" she repeats, wonderingly. "Taza?" Finding it impossible to make her understand what taza are, I sketch a cup and spoon upon the whitewashed wall, whereupon she triumphantly supplies us with 2 pudding basins and 2 metal gravy spoons of enormous size, so that we look like comic characters taking tea in a pantomime. "Ecco! You carry fire about with you!" exclaims this child of nature, staring at the blazing Etna with the open-mouthed astonishment of a savage. Not caring to enter into an explanation of the nature and uses of spirits of wine, I venture to remind her of the bread, and inquire if she has yet served the men with their wine. She nods, and then shakes her head again, with a pause between. Vino si, she replies, oracularly. Pane no. Wine yes, bread no. It seems only reasonable to suggest that, having no bread in the house, she should send out for some immediately. But no, she wags not her head this time but her forefinger, a gesture purely Italian. It is of no use to send out for bread, there is none to be had. There is none in the P.S. No one has any, no one in Gosalda, not even the Parocco. It all comes up from the valley, when they have any. It ought to come up twice a week, but the baker is not always punctual. It is now 5 days since he came last, and there is not a crust left in the village. But why do you not make your own bread up here in Gosalda? I asked, when she came to the end of this astounding statement. Signora, we have no baker. And what do you eat when the baker does not come? Signora, we eat polenta. Happily we had a little bread in the luncheon basket, but less than usual, having given some to the mules after their hard scramble up the pass. We were better off, however, than Giuseppe and Clementi, who got nothing, not even a dish of polenta, and this in a village numbering at least some 400 or 500 souls. The peasants of the mountain district between Agordo and Primiero seemed, as far as one could judge in a single day's journey, altogether poorer, dirtier, and more ignorant than elsewhere. Most of those whom we passed on the road or saw at work in the field had goitres, and few understood anything but their own barbarous patois. Even the landlady of the Gosalda albergo, although she was no doubt superior to many of her neighbours, spoke very little intelligible Italian, and had no kind of local information to give. Being asked the name of the noble mountain that formed the main feature of the view before her window, she replied that it was the Monte Cereda, then that it was the Sasso di Mise, and finally admitted that she did not know for certain whether it had a name at all. Yet this was a question that she must have been continually called upon to answer. The mountain, however, as set down in Ball's map, proved to be the Monte Preballo, the highest point of which, sometimes called Il Pis, and sometimes Il Pisocco, rises, according to Mayer, to a height of 6,733 feet above the sea level. A second pass, the Passo della Cereda, yet lies between us and Primiero. The distance is reported to be about 2 hours and a half from Gosaldo, and a good mule track all the way. The path begins pretty well, being steep but shady, and winding up between rocky banks, high hedges, and overarching trees. This, however, is too pleasant to last, and soon it begins to exhibit, in an exaggerated degree, all the worst features of the worst parts of the Gosalda Pass. The Gosalda Pass was steep, but the Cereda Pass is indefinitely steeper. The Gosalda Pass was wet underfoot, but the Cereda Pass is for miles neither more nor less than the bed of a small torrent. Nor are other and larger torrents wanting, for twice we have to dismount and make our way on foot from stone to stone across rushing streams some 30 feet in width. The wonder is that anyone should be found to live in a place so difficult of access. Yet we continually pass cottages and clusters of cottages by the wayside, and the great valley down below is quite thickly populated. One woman, standing at her garden gate, nursing a wizened baby of about 6 months old, inquires eagerly where we come from, and if we do not find it a brutta paese. Being assured, however, that the signoras consider it not brutta but bellissima, she is struck quite dumb with amazement. And where, oh, where are you going? Is her next question, asked with a frenzied kind of eagerness, as if her life depended on the answer. I reply that we are going to Primiero, Predazzo, Vigo, and other places. To Primiero, she repeats breathlessly. To Predazzo? Jesu Maria, what a number of bad roads you have before you! So saying, she leans out over the gate and watches us with unfeigned compassion and wonder as long as we remained in sight. Now the valley sinks lower, and the mountains rise higher with every step of the way. The road achieves an impossible degree of steepness. The mules, left to themselves, climb in the cleverest way, and act as pioneers to those on foot. At last comes a place which can no longer be described as a road but a barrier, being in truth the last rock wall below the plateau to which we have all this time been mounting. Here even the mules have to be helped, and, partly by pushing, partly by pulling, reached the top at last. And now another great prairie, somewhat like the Gosalda summit, only more wild and barren, opens away in the same manner and in the same direction, like the enchanted meadow in the fairy tale that stretched on forever and had no ending. A little lonely osteria in the midst of all this wilderness is so joyfully hailed by our famishing guides, who find here not only good wine but good white bread, and plenty of it. It has to be a short rest, however, for the day is advancing and we have already been 9 hours on the road, including halts. "How long is it now to Primiero?" asks Giuseppe as we are moving off again. To which the good woman replies in the self-same words as she of Gosalda, 2 hours and a half! As a rule, the finest wild flowers throughout these mountain districts have lovely exposed situations, and flourish most luxuriantly on heights not far below the limit of vegetation. On the Cereda, instead of growing in rich confusion as at other places, they separate into distinct masses, showing here as a hillside of fire-coloured lilies, yonder as a pinky dell of ragged robin, farther on still as a long blue tract of wild vetch interspersed with slender spires of Canterbury bells. No painter would dare faithfully to represent these incredible slopes of alternate rose and gold and blue. At last the path begins to dip, and our hopes to rise. Every moment we expect to see the opening of some green vista with Primiero at the end of it. Meeting a decently dressed peasant of the farmer class, however, and putting the same question to him, in the same words as before, we are confounded to receive precisely the same answer. "Circa 2 ore e mezza, signore." About 2 hours and a half, ladies. Profoundly discouraged, we ride on after this in mournful silence. It is now more than 3 hours since we left Gosalda, and yet we seem to be as far as ever from Primiero. If we were not tired, if we were not hungry, if the mules were not beginning to stumble at every step, the thing would be almost comic, but as it was, we go on funereally, following always the course of a small torrent, and skirting long pasture tracts dotted over with brown chalets. By and by, having made another 2 or 3 miles of way, we come upon a gang of country folk at work in the new-mown hay. This time Giuseppe raises his voice, and shouts the stereotyped inquiry. The answer comes back with crushing distinctness. About 3 hours. I begin to think we are under the dominion of some dreadful spell. I have visions of jogging on forever, like a party of wandering Jews, till all 4 have become old, grey, and decrepit. Suddenly Clementi turns round with an eye all smothered glee, and says, "Don't you think, Signora, we should get there quicker if we turned back?" It is a small joke, but it serves to make us merry over our misfortunes. After this we put the same question to every one we meet, to a group of women carrying faggots, to an old man driving a pig, to a plump priest riding sensibly on an ass, like Sancho Panza, to a woodcutter going home with his axe over his shoulder, like a herdsman out of livery. Each, of course, gives a different answer. One says 2 hours, another 2 hours and a half, a third 3 hours, and so on. And then, all at once, when we are not in the least expecting it, we come upon a grand opening, and see Castel Pietra on its inaccessible peak of cloven rock, standing up straight before us. Another moment, and the valley opens out at an untold depth below, a glittering vision of chestnut woods, villages, vineyards, and purple mountains about whose summits the storm clouds are fast gathering. "Ecco Primiero," says Clementi, pointing to a many-steepled town at the end of a long white road, still miles and miles away. This Castel Pietra, the chromolithograph of which, as seen from the valley, is already familiar to most readers in Gilbert and Churchill's book, is the property of a certain Count Welsperg, by whose ancestors it was built in the old feudal times, and who still lives in Primiero. The solitary tooth of rock on which it stands has split from top to bottom some time within the last century, since when it is quite inaccessible. The present owner, when a young man, succeeded once, and once only, by the help of ropes, ladders, and workmen from Primiero, in climbing with some friends to the height of those deserted towers. But that was many a year ago, and since then the owls and bats have garrisoned them undisturbed. The castle stands, a lonely sentinel, at the opening of the great Dolomite cul-de-sac, known as the Val di Canali, and is a conspicuous object from all parts of the valley north of Primiero. The final dip down from the Castel Pietra rock is achieved by the means of a stony and almost perpendicular road, compared with which the descent from the Gemmi on the Leuch side is level and agreeable walking. Loose stones that roll from beneath the foot, and abrupt slopes of slippery rock make it difficult for even pedestrians with alpenstocks, but it is worse still for the mules, which slide and struggle and scramble in a pitiful way, being helped up behind by the ends of their tails ignominiously. At last we reach the level, hurry along the dusty road, pass through the ruinous-looking village of Tonadigo, and, just as the church clocks are striking 7 p.m., ride into Primiero. Here at the Aquila Nera, kept by Signora Bonetti, we find rest, good food, a friendly welcome, and better rooms than the outside of the house, and above all, the entrance would lead one to expect. That entrance is dreadful, a mere dark arch leading to a goat stable, but then the kitchen and public rooms are on the first floor, and the visitors' rooms on the second, so that the house may said to only begin one remove above the level of the street. It is curious how soon one learns to be content with these humble Tyrolean albergos, and to regard as friends and almost equals the kindly folks that keep them. Nor indeed without reason, for setting aside that perfume of antique republicanism that seems yet to linger in all the air that was once Venice, those Tyrolean innkeepers are, for the most part, peoples of ancient families who have owned lands and filled responsible offices in connection with their native communes ever since the Middle Ages. Thus we hear of a Ghedina of the Ampezzo holding an important military command at the beginning of the 15th century. The Giacomellis, who now keep the Nave d'Oro at Predazzo, were nobles some few hundred years ago. The Pezzis date back as far as Caprile, as had records to show, and take their name from Monte Pezza, on the lower slopes of which they yet hold the remnant of their ancient estates. And the Cercenas of Forno di Zoldi, of whose inn I shall have more to say hereafter, are mentioned, as we find by Mr. Gilbert's book on Cadore, in documents more than 500 years old. I do not know whether the Bonettis of Primiero claim either a long bourgeois pedigree or a past nobility, but they are particularly courteous and hospitable, and I see no reason for supposing them to be in any respect less well born than the others. It is only right that persons travelling or intending to travel in these valleys should be acquainted with the foregoing facts. And it would be well if they remembered they are not dealing here with innkeepers of the ordinary continental stamp, but with persons who are for the most part quite independent of the albergo as a source of profit, and ready to receive strangers with a friendliness that does not appear as an item in the bill. If the accommodation is primitive, it is at all events the very best they have to offer, and it is immensely cheap. If the attendance is not first rate, there is a pleasant homeliness about the domestic arrangements that more than makes up for any little shortcomings in other ways. The mother of the family generally cooks for her guests, the father looks after the stabling, the sons and daughters wait at table. All take a personal interest in one's comfort, all are anxious to oblige. To treat them with hauteur or with suspicion, or to give unnecessary trouble, is both unjust and impolitic. I have seen old Signora Pezzi wounded almost to tears by the way in which a certain English party secured all their possessions under lock and key every time they ventured outside the doors. The same people, on going away, disputed every item of their moderate bill, as if, no matter how little they were charged, it was to be taken for granted that they were being imposed upon somehow. The ultimate result of such conduct on the part of our dear country people is sufficiently obvious. The old innkeeping families will ere long close their houses against us in disgust. A class of extortionate speculators, probably Swiss, will step in and occupy the ground. Newer and smarter, but far less comfortable hotels will spring up like mushrooms in these quiet valleys. All direct communication between the native townsfolk and the travelling stranger will be intercepted, and the simplicity, the poetry, the homely charm of the Dolomite district will be gone forever. End of section 23. Unfrequented Valleys. Section 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 10. Primiero to Predazzo, Part 1. The town of Primiero lies partly in the plain, and partly climbs the hill on which the church is built. The houses in the flat have a semi-Venetian character, like the houses at Ceneda and Longarone. The houses on the hill are of the quaintest German Gothic, and remind one of the steep-roofed, many-turreted medieval buildings in Albert Durer's backgrounds. The curious juxtaposition of dissimilar architectural styles is accounted for by the fact that Primiero, in itself more purely Italian than either Caprile or Agordo, became transferred to Austria and partly colonized by German operatives about the latter end of the 14th century. The Tedeschi, drafted thither for the working of a famous silver mine, took root, acquired wealth, built the church, and left their impress on the place, just as the Romans left theirs in Gaul and the Greeks in Sicily. The early history of Primiero, how it became subject first to the Goths, then to the Lombards, next (A.D. 1027) to the bishops of Trent, next again (A.D. 1300) to the Scaligieri of Verona, then (A.D. 1315) to Prince Charles of Luxembourg, and finally to an Archduke of the House of Habsburg, is but a repetition of the history of most places along the line of the Bolognese frontier. That the valley was at least twice or thrice invaded, and Castel Pietra as often besieged by the Venetians, is also a matter of history. It does not appear, however, that Primiero ever became an actual appanage of the Great Republic, although the neighbouring village of Transacqua, which is indeed almost a suburb of Primiero, and is only separated from the town by the Cismone and a meadow or two, was ceded to and held by Venice in undisputed right for a length of time both before and after the date when the rest of the valley passed into the strong grasp of Austria, a grasp unloosened to this day. For Primiero, so Italian in its scenery, its climate, its language, its national type, is Austrian still. We passed the frontier somewhere about half-way between the village of Gosalda and the Osteria on the Cereda Pass, but there was no black and yellow pole to mark the boundary, and we re-entered the dominions of the Emperor Francis Joseph without knowing it. So lately as last summer, the month of July, 1872, Primiero was as inaccessible for wheeled vehicles as Venice. Whatever there may be now, there was no line of unbroken carriage road leading to or from the valley in any direction. Be your destination what it might, you could drive but a few miles this way or a few miles that, and then must take to either the alpenstock or the saddle. In short, every avenue to the outer world was barred by a circle of passes, all of which were practicable for mules, but not one practicable throughout for even carettini. A fine military road is, however, now in course of construction between Primiero and Predazzo, so that a direct communication for vehicles will soon be established with Neumarkt on the Botzen and Brenner line. This road was already open last summer as far as the Hospice of San Martino, and was in progress for some miles farther. Perhaps by now it may reach as far as the Val Trevignolo. Another excellent road runs southward from Primiero to Pontedo, the limit of the Austrian frontier, but there unfortunately it is joined on the Italian side by a steep and very rough mule track, which continues as far as Fonzaso. From Fonzaso, however, another carriage road leads to Feltre, and at Feltre one is in the centre of a network of fine highways radiating to Belluno, Treviso, Bassano, and Trient. Less than 10 years ago Primiero was even more primitive than now. The daily posts, we are told, came in and went out on muleback. No rattle of wheels disturbed the silent streets. No wheel tracks guard the pavement. At night the good townsfolk went about with little twinkling lanterns, and hung an oil lamp here and there outside their doors. Things are not quite so Arcadian now. The letter bags are carried for at least a few miles down the valley in a light carretta. The rattling of wheels has ceased to be regarded as a phenomenon. A gasometer has been erected near, too near, the entrance to the town, and the inhabitants are doing all they can to get a telegraphic wire in connection with Feltre. The town is very clean, cheerful, and picturesque. In the piazza on the flat, and in some of the side streets, for there are side streets in Primiero, one sees many large and really good houses. They call them palazzos. Some of these are built over great cavernous arched entrances, and lighted by Venetian twin windows with ogive arched tops and twisted pillars. Some are enriched with elegant balconies of wrought iron, and on one door I observed an elaborate knocker and 2 handles in the form of half-length female figures of exquisite workmanship. The German houses going up the hill, the foot pavement of which, by the way, consists of squares of wood, are quite different. They have tiny windows filled with circular glass panes about 3 inches in diameter, and high steep roofs pierced by rows of dormers, and surmounted by fantastic weathercocks. The ancient First Amt, with its quaint oriel turrets, looped-holed walls, medieval windows, and rows of frescoed shields charged with faded armorial bearings, would be quite in its proper place if transported to Würzburg or Ulm. This curious building, which stands at the top of the hill just over against the church, was erected by the early silver workers, probably as a kind of fortified guard-house, and as a place of deposit for their store of precious metal. Many houses, both on the hill and down in the flat, are decorated externally with friezes and arabesques of a simple character, while over almost every house door is painted up this pious phrase, Christus nobiscum stat. Our first day in Primiero befell upon a Sunday. The church bells began ringing merrily before 5 a.m. and went on till 10. The streets were thronged with peasants in their holiday clothes, and in the piazza sat a group of countrywomen with baskets of crimson cherries, little golden pears, and green lettuces for sale. It was a gay and animated scene. The men with their knee breeches, white stockings, conical felt hats, and jackets loosely thrown across one shoulder like a cloak, looked as if they had just stepped out of one of Pinelli's etchings. Some wore a crimson sash about the waist, and some a bunch of flowers and feathers in the hat. The women wore white cloths upon their heads tied cornerwise, and had the hair cut across the forehead in a Savigny fringe. Their voices were curiously alike, soft and deep and guttural. Looking in at the church door while Mass was being performed, I saw the whole nave as one sea of white headdresses, and for the moment fancied myself peeping once more into the chapel of the Béguinage at Bruges. It is a gloomy church, externally more Tyrolean than German, with an unusually high steep roof and lofty spire, internally of a severe, well-proportioned 13th-century Gothic. 2 recessed and canopied state pews of old carved oak stand on either side of the principal entrance, facing the east window and the altar, and the armorial bearings of the silver workers are emblazoned again on the walls of the chancel. Having heard much of a certain antique silver monstrance, or portable shrine for the exhibition of the Host, made of the pure silver of the Primiero mines and presented to the church by these same silver workers some 600 years ago, we waited till the congregation had dispersed, and then asked to be permitted to see it. A grave and gentlemanly young priest received us in the sacristy, and the monstrance was taken out of a great oak press, as old apparently as the church itself. This curious historical relic, preserved uninjured throughout all the vicissitudes of the Middle Ages, stands about 2 feet high, a light Gothic spire, in form somewhat like the spire of Milan Cathedral, surrounded by a gilt cross, and wrought into a multitude of delicate little pinnacles enclosing tiny niches peopled with figures of evangelists and saints. Our curiosity gratified, we thanked the young Parocco and took our leave, whereupon, drawing himself up in a stately fashion, he wished us viaggio sano, buon divertimento e salute, a kind of limited benediction fitted for the dismissal of well-dressed heretics. It was impossible not to be continually startled that Sunday morning by the repeated discharges of musketry and small cannon which kept waking the mountain echoes round about, especially just before and after High Mass. These came from the little hamlet of Transacqua on the other side of the Cismone, where the villagers were making high festa in honour of the arrival of a new Parocco. Walking that way towards evening, we found a green triumphal arch erected at the opening of the Transacqua road on the farther end of the bridge, and another at the entrance to the village. The porch was also festooned with garlands and devices. All was now still. The Parocco had gone to his new home, and the villagers to their cottages. We strolled into the empty church, and saw, by a little written notice wayfared against the door, that it was dedicated to St. Mark, as might be expected in a parish that had once been a dependency of Venice. "The Signoras have come to see our Titian," said a croaking voice at my elbow, "but it is too dark, too dark. It should be seen at midday, when the light comes through the side window." I turned, and saw a shrivelled, slipshod sexton, all in black, with a big key in his hand. He had come to lock the church up, and found the forestieri inside. Every insignificant little town, every obscure village that has ever belonged to Venice, has its pretended Titian to show. Setting aside the Titians of Pieve di Cadore, which are unquestionably genuine, and one at Zoppé, of which I shall have to tell by and by, there are dozens of others scattered through the country, which it would be flattery to describe even as copies. There was one to be seen the other day, for instance, at Cencenighe, but having heard that it was more than doubtful, we preferred resting in the shelter of the albergo to toiling up to the church in the broiling sunshine. The altar-piece at Transacqua is an ideal portrait of St. Mark, only the head and hands of which, however, are claimed as the work of Titian. It is said to have been presented to the church by one of the Doges of Venice. It looks a poor thing, seen thus in the gathering dusk, but the light is so bad that one may as well give its authenticity the benefit of the doubt. End of section 24.